Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you for inviting me. And I'm so sorry that I can't be with you today, especially given that I'm in London and the weather is dreadful. As I've been introduced, I'm a lecturer at King's College London in the Department of Global Health and Social Medicine in the UK. And I wanted to talk to you today about a paper that I wrote with my colleague that was published last year in the Journal of Medical Ethics, but also some other work that I've been doing, which is thinking about how we can reimagine research ethics frameworks to include aspects of environmental sustainability. And most of my thinking around this topic has come from my expertise in digital technologies and data-driven methodologies in research more generally, and how these technologies and methodologies are disrupting the research ethics frameworks that we're quite used to and have traditionally used. So the format of my talk will be I can go through this very quickly because we've just heard from the previous speaker, but to describe the adverse environmental and associated impacts of digital technologies and digital research endeavors, to argue that we need normative consideration in the research process to consider these issues, but that historically research ethics governance frameworks do not explicitly consider these impacts. Then I will propose a modification of Emmanuel et al.'s International Research Ethics Framework. So if you're not aware of this, this is a very well-known international research ethics framework that's used extremely widely. And most research ethics frameworks will resonate with this particular one. I will then describe what it might look like in practice if we want to modify research ethics frameworks. What does that mean for researchers? What does it mean for policymakers? And then finally, describe why it might be particularly difficult to implement this in practice. So I can probably run through the environmental impacts associated with digital research quite quickly because we've heard about it just now. So we know that digital research is based on digital technologies, which are very much material. They're based on computers that are housed in data centers, and we heard about the models and the calculating of the energy related to using models and also to storing data. So I can go through that quite quickly. But then it's not just the use phase, as we just heard, but it's also other environmental impacts. So there's environmental impacts related to the mining of resources that are needed in the manufacture of the digital technologies upon which we conduct our research. And mining per se is not necessarily morally problematic, but the way in which we mine can be morally problematic. So if we think about where we're mining for the minerals that are needed for the digital tech revolution, and the type of regulation that exists or doesn't exist, and the type of effect that this may have on workers in the mines, both on their social concerns, their work, their employment, but also their health, because their health is very impacted when they work in these mines. And there's many questions around the exploitative and practices and extractive practices. And then very quickly, I don't need to go on about the energy demands because we now know what they are because we've just heard all about them. But just to say that they will depend very much on where data is being stored and where it's being processed in terms of how that relates to, say, for example, greenhouse gas emissions, right? So if you're running your models in Australia, then the greenhouse gas emissions are going to probably be much higher than if you're going to run them, in Scotland or somewhere else similar. And then right through to the world that we live in, where we throw away our digital hardware more often than we potentially should be doing so. And we have ended up having these huge electronic waste dump sites that have kind of sprung up in the lower to middle income countries that are taking on our waste that we don't want to have in the global north. And in these dump sites, I mean, many countries are trying to getting a handle on how they can recycle the materials that come out of these dump sites. And I'm doing some work in India where there's many recycling plants, but actually the majority of the e-waste is dumped illegally in these dump sites. And some of the biggest e-waste dump sites in the world are also some of the most polluted areas in the world. And this is because people, and I'm sure you're aware of this, people come to live around the dump sites to be able to extract the very precious minerals that are in the hardware and the monitors and the cables and use them to sell for their livelihoods, but they do so in an unregulated way. So they do using a lot of acid baths and a lot of burning, which is contributing to the air pollution and the problems associated with that. And then Josh Lepowski has written this really great book called Reassembling Rubbish that argues that we shouldn't just see e-waste right at the end of the chain, but actually the whole way through we're developing waste. So even at the manufacturing stage, we have a whole range of toxic emissions that kind of leak into the water, that leak into our land, that really cause an effect on our environment and then the health of us, of the people that live around those environments. So we kind of start thinking about environmental justice issues. So we're starting to see in the research community that change is happening. So you don't have to look very far to see publications. And again, we just heard in the previous talk about trying to assess the carbon emissions associated with, for example, AI and developing AI, but also neuroscientists are doing a lot of work around this. Astrophysics are trying to measure their carbon emissions, particle physics, a whole range of different areas. Bioinformatics, I know, have done a lot of work around this as well, to try and start to be able to measure their carbon emissions associated with their research and other environmental impacts, and then try and mitigate them as much as possible. But and change is important, and change is really, really great. But I would argue that when we make decisions to do something, that it's important that we morally reflect on why we're doing it. So what is the ethical justification for that change? And we need to be clear about what that is. So I've just put up here 2 different ethical justifications for why we really need to think about these environmental impacts. So the first one, it comes from a utilitarianism argument. So I'm sure you're all aware that utilitarianism is an ethical principle that argues that the correct decision that we should make is the one that brings on the greatest good. So you weigh up, the negative effects of something and you weigh up the positive effects. And if you overarchingly have more positive effects, then that's the decision that you should make. And research ethics kind of engages a little bit with utilitarianism because we talk very much about cost benefit. So it does come in there. And using this approach, this ethical argument, we could argue that failing to consider the burdens that are associated with the manufacture, use, and disposal of digital technologies creates imbalances in any utilitarian decision-making approach, because it means that ignoring key links in the consequentialist pathway that are associated with harms that come from the use of these technologies during the research process get ignored. And Pearce and Jamieson in 2004 argue that when these burdens are added, everyday decisions unquestioned by ethicists and regarded as rational and even praiseworthy may become, or may be seen to be, questionable and possibly even maleficent. So that's one way where we can kind of create an ethical justification for why we really need to think about these approaches in data science. And the other one is a justice issue, where I kind of just mentioned briefly before. So justice, as I'm sure you're aware, is a key underlying principle of many modern day societies. And in a globalized world, to be just means ensuring the fair and equitable distribution of benefits and burdens. And this is not only within national boundaries, but it's also for those who are subject to a given governance structure. So what we're seeing here, and what's been emerging over the past few decades and so forth in political philosophy, is that understandings of justice go beyond our nation, beyond our own citizens, because we live in a globalized world. So that means that we need to argue that all individuals and communities affected by any particular process, technology, and or product, wherever they are in the world, and whatever aspect of the product, process, or technology they are affected by, have moral standing and should be the subjects of justice considerations. And this draws on the work of Marion Young or Nancy Fraser's all subjective principles. And we see this in practice. If you think about, the sweatshops and how there was a uproaring around there, that's all based on the idea that justice goes beyond our boundaries because we live in a globalized world where we're using products that were made elsewhere. But if you look at current research ethics frameworks, they don't consider these issues. So historically, research ethics frameworks have revolved around ethical principles concerned with the protection, rights, safety, and welfare of individual research participants only. And that's because it's based on, the history of biomedical innovations. More recently, research ethics frameworks have opened up. So and this has been around communities. So as we move towards, and I'm drawing on AI here, but there's many other kind of more globalized research approaches that go beyond the biomedical model. But there's this need to respect the community that should be emphasized to sit alongside this very individual approach. And this comes from the argument that community harms are more than the sum of individual values and interests. And just to give you some examples, for example, how an AI algorithm to detect skin cancer was shown to have been optimized for fair skin, but being less able to detect melanoma on dark skin. Or, for example, using AI for diagnosis, given been talking in the health community, which is where I work, where AI is being thought of as a good diagnostic tool in terms of predicting or diagnosing illnesses based on what somebody looks like, but then only being trained on certain types of faces. And so here we can see how in a particular research project, we may not consider these community harms, but actually the harms that can come towards certain communities by using these AI models really require us to go beyond that individual approach to a more community approach. But still, the moral gaze has only focused on humans and on only particular humans. So one of two things needs to happen if we agree that we need to consider the environmental impacts of digital technologies. And this will depend on your philosophical beliefs. So either way, there's an argument to be made. So one is that we need to expand our moral gaze to include the environment, because we see the environment as having particular value akin to human value. And that's a very ecocentric ethics approach. It's quite strong, and many people wouldn't agree with that. But even if you only expand your moral gaze to include humans, so that's an anthropocentric ethics, you still now require, given issues of justice, given issues of utilitarianism, to consider the harms caused by the adverse environmental impacts of digital technologies, because those environmental effects have effects on humans. And I'm just writing with Jeffrey D'Souza, and we're just writing a commentary piece at the moment to argue that, in fact, we actually have a duty based on the way that research ethics frameworks are developed through a cost-benefit analysis to expand our moral gaze. So we've argued that in evaluating the risks of research, focuses primarily on those risks related to participants. So in digital science, this would be around, for example, data governance issues, privacy, and so forth. However, when calculating the potential benefits, we expand their purview to include non-participants, including those from both present day as well as future generations. So this is just the idea of when we conduct research, we hope that that will contribute to benefit society, not just, the research participants, but more broadly. So the focus on risks to participants is understandable, given the histories, research-related harms that have affected research participants in the past. But nonetheless, it stands to reason that if present-day and future generation non-participants matter when calculating the potential benefits of research, then present-day and future generation non-participants should also matter when calculating the risks and harms associated with the research. To not do so, we've argued, gives rise to a risk-benefit calculation and research conduct that is one-sided, misguided, and does not properly respect the rights, safety, and welfare of non-participants and future generations. And so I developed this kind of research ethics framework taken from Emmanuel in 2008. And that's got a number of pillars in it. And where I felt those pillars needed to modify, I've kind of put it on this table. So there's social value. So any research project needs to have social value. And I'm arguing that the environment needs to be considered within that. Another principle is that we should respect participants and also community partnerships, which is what I was talking about previously. And I've argued this should be changed to respect for persons, communities, and the environment, and that we should be thinking about the adverse environmental impacts of using digital technologies during research and taking steps to reduce them. And then the biggest change, I suppose, is fair participant selection. So the research ethics framework is very kind of non-digital. It's obviously from 2008. And it talks about the way that participants get selected in studies, and they need to be selected in a way that's fair and that allows generation of reliable and valid data and minimizes harm. I argue this should be replaced by justice, so that we see the fair collection, storage, use, linkage, and sharing of data. And that's all what the issues that Sasha was talking about around bias and so forth, as well as an attention to equity and benefit sharing within research communities, but furthermore consideration to environmental justice issues as well that are associated with the manufacture, use, disposal of digital technologies used during the research process. So there's a social justice and an environmental justice issue that needs to go in there. And then finally, that risk-benefit ratio that I was talking about needs to also include the environmental impacts that come from using these technologies. So what does this mean in practice? So there are things that researchers and research ethics committees can do, including, for example, questioning or thinking about where data is stored. So as I said, if you're storing data in Australia, then your carbon emissions are going to be much higher than if you're storing data in, for example, Scotland. There are differential storage methods for data. So long-term or long latency times can lead to lower carbon emissions or reduce energy consumption. So if you're willing to give up that latency time and to store your data slightly further away in a data center that is responsible for less carbon emissions, and that can allow you to take that consideration into account. Algorithms can be optimized for environmental considerations. Tasha was talking about, was it carbon code? I can't remember, but I'm sure she can say it at the end. Co-carbon, thank you. Co-carbon, which I should know, and there's many other different carbon calculators that you can use as well. And there are many people that have written guidelines on this. So I've just written one article that talks about guidelines to make your computing more environmentally sustainable. For research policymakers, what's really important is that we don't see improving efficiency as solving the problem, right? Because if we increase the efficiency of digital technologies, what's going to happen is we're going to increase our consumption. So as Sasha was saying, AI models just get bigger and bigger and bigger, right? And that happens because as we become more efficient, we just use more. And I spoke to one health researcher and I said, what would you do if, the AI you were using became more efficient? And they said, well, just run a bigger algorithm. It's, we'll use what we have and then go further. So it's important for research and policymakers to think about, constraints or what constraints need to be put in place, especially during, the climate emergency. And then also for research policymakers really thinking, and I don't think the audience will particularly like it, but also how we can share what the type of research we're doing, not just with technological solutions and technological innovations, but also social innovation, right? Let's question where we want to get to in society and not always think that, a digital solution is the best way to get there. But just to, and I am finishing up, but just to say that I've thought quite a lot about this, and I feel that we need to be really careful when we're pushing for what researchers can do to make their research more environmentally sustainable, that we don't lead to this responsibilization of the individual. And when I spoke to researchers in the field, they all spoke about, wanting to have this collective responsibility, wanting to do something, wanting to, be really careful about the algorithms they use and how often they ran them and when they ran them. And they spoke about basically not wanting to have a change. They weren't going to change too much unless they were forced to. So they were calling for this regulation. They said, we're regulated anyway. Tell us what to do and we'll do it. But we have to be careful about compliance-based approaches because they can be really problematic. We've seen this with research ethics, which has become very much a compliance-based approach. And you may have heard people saying things like, I've got ethics, I've done ethics, as though as long as I've completed this box, I'm ethically sound, everything I do is ethically appropriate, which is not what ethics is at all. Ethics is about reflecting at every stage of the way the types of moral decision-making you're doing. And what we don't want to get to is a situation where we have the same thing for sustainability. And I agree with you, Sasha, about that relationship between sustainability and ethics, but we don't want to go down that path where people are just ticking the box and actually we have these broader problems that need to be addressed. So we're just adding a bureaucratic layer for perhaps, not getting the gains that we need. So we need better rules. We need alternative approaches. And I think we can have a lot of discussion around that. So just to finish up my final slide, what are the limitations and considerations of this approach? Well, should researchers have responsibility? It's an ethical question. Can they have an ethical question? Can they have responsibility, which is also an ethical question, but also it moves into sociology. If we argue that they shouldn't necessarily have responsibility, or they can't enact responsibility, as Donna Haraway would say, responsibility is about having the ability to respond. What does that mean? We can still argue that there's value in researchers thinking about their emissions, because if we want to make change, now I'm thinking more sociologically, we need to do so both bottom up and top down. So we've just done some really interesting work looking at the history of animal research ethics and how that became professionalized into practice. And one of the key takeaways was that it wasn't about the ethics or about how people felt about animals. It was more about kind of having this very bottom up and top down approaches where there was a whole amount of advocacy that was driving change at the top level. So it's not, sometimes we can think in terms of ethics and the abstract, but it's also important to think sociologically. Actually, even if we feel we don't have a responsibility, if we want to make a change, we actually need to do some work bottom up. And then some other considerations: will regulations lead to compliance-based approaches? How can we kind of get around that, or think about other clever or imaginative ways? And then finally, how to address the tensions between other priorities. So some of my interviewees spoke about having debates about where to store their data. They had to store it in a data center in Africa because of data sovereignty and issues with privacy, but actually that had really high carbon emissions. So it became a balancing act, and I have an issue with trade-offs and balancing acts, because I believe that we need to just try and think of more creative solutions. But there are many priorities that emerged when I spoke to my researchers about considering environmental factors, and these related to things like, well, if we're not incentivized to think about them, we're not going to think about them, because we have to get published as quickly as possible, and that's going to be the most important thing. We have to get the next grant. So if the funding body isn't going to, invest in us to think about these issues, we're not going to think about them. So that's my whirlwind of thinking about environmental impacts in digital science for research ethics. I'll stop there. If you have any questions, I would love to hear them. Thank you.